You finally get that promotion, the one you've been, well, just killing yourself for. Or you finally look at a deeply demanding relative and just say, no, I can't do this anymore.
Right, you finally set a boundary.
Exactly. You cross that finish line, you set that boundary, and instead of feeling this wave of pure, unadulterated relief, you feel sick to your stomach. You feel this heavy, lingering sense of guilt.
Yeah.
And you start wondering, why does doing something entirely good for myself feel like I just committed a crime?
It's a shockingly universal experience. That uncomfortable shadow that creeps in the exact moment things in your life are actually going well.
Right.
Or, the moment you finally prioritize your own oxygen mask.
And that tension is exactly what we are exploring today in this deep dive. We are pulling from a highly provocative source document titled, Your Life is Not a Debt. Now, we need to establish something right up front.
Yeah, always important to add a caveat here.
Right. This text presents a very specific, fiercely argued philosophical framework. It completely flips our traditional views of altruism, morality, and what it means to be a good person right on their head.
It really does.
So our goal today isn't to tell you this philosophy is the absolute truth or to endorse it. Living the way this document suggests carries heavy social consequences. But our mission is to impartially unpack these core radical arguments, lay out the underlying logic, and, well, let you evaluate these ideas for yourself.
And to do that, we have to start with a core premise that reframes the entire conversation. The argument hinges on this single foundational idea. Guilt is an emotion, not a verdict.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because that is a massive distinction. Most of us go through life treating the physical sensation of guilt as absolute, undeniable proof that we've done something wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if my stomach is in knots, I must be a bad person.
Which is a completely understandable reaction, because emotions feel like facts. But if we look at the physiological reality, an emotion is just an alert. Guilt tells you that an internal conflict exists between your actions and your moral standards. It's a dashboard warning light.
Just a warning light.
Yeah. But a warning light doesn't prove that the engine is actually failing. It just proves the sensor got tripped. The facts, the actions, and the moral standard that produce that feeling, they still have to be rationally judged. So we have to draw a sharp line between genuine guilt and false guilt.
So if guilt is just an alert, there must be a difference between an alert that caught a real intruder and an alert triggered by the wind. I'm assuming genuine guilt is when you've actually broken your own moral code, like lying or stealing or betraying someone you care about.
Precisely. Genuine guilt stems from actual wrongdoing. If you evade a responsibility that you legitimately accepted, you have violated a rational moral principle that is grounded in reality.
Okay, that makes sense.
In that scenario, guilt is a profoundly healthy signal. It's a warning you that your actions are actively destroying something you value.
Which is the intruder setting off the alarm. That makes total sense. But then we have false guilt. This is the guilt that washes over you when you just want a decent life, when you protect your time, when you succeed in your career, when you take a weekend to just sleep.
Yeah.
That feeling comes from accepting a questionable moral principle, not from doing any actual harm. So, false guilt is essentially a faulty smoke detector. It had us going off, the lights are flashing, the siren is deafening, making you panic, but there's no fire. You just made toast.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it.
Yeah.
You're reacting to an alarm that has absolutely no business ringing.
But I have to push back on that a little bit because knowing it is a false alarm doesn't turn the siren off. I mean, if there's no fire, why is the alarm so incredibly loud? Why does it feel so overwhelmingly physically real when I tell a coworker no to taking on their project because I want to see my family?
Well, to understand the volume of that alarm, we have to look at how the smoke detector gets wired in the first place. The argument here points directly at our cultural habits and our moral traditions. It's a conditioning of microscopic increments.
Like when you're growing up.
Exactly. You're praised as a young child for sharing a toy you really didn't want to share. You watch countless movies where the ultimate hero is always the one who dies for everyone else. We are quietly, constantly taught that the surest evidence of goodness is how much of yourself you are willing to surrender.
So we've literally linked goodness entirely to loss. The brain wires the dopamine hit of social approval to the act of self-erasure.
It is rarely stated that bluntly, but yes.
Okay.
It arrives in these small, everyday expectations. A good person is supposed to give more, ask for less, suppress their own inconvenient desires,
Right.
and feel slightly uneasy about having more than the person next to them. Over decades, that conditioning rewires your internal smoke detector to interpret any act of self-preservation as a moral failing.
Wow. Okay, so if our cultural traditions are wiring these faulty smoke detectors, we really need to examine the specific code that's causing the glitch. And this framework points a very big, uncompromising finger at altruism.
It does, and we have to be extremely precise here. When people hear a critique of altruism, they immediately think it's an attack on kindness or generosity or helping a friend in trouble.
Yeah, that's the standard definition we all think of.
But that isn't the philosophical definition of altruism used in this text. The doctrine of altruism, in the strict sense, is the belief that self-sacrifice for others is the ultimate standard of moral virtue.
Okay.
Is the idea that an action is only truly good if you gain nothing from it, or better yet, if you actually suffer for it.
Which leads to a distinction I found incredibly illuminating in the text. Giving something up is not always a sacrifice. We use that word way too loosely.
We really do.
Sacrifice, in the specific destructive moral sense, means surrendering a greater value for a lesser value. It means giving up something you desperately care about for something you don't care about at all, simply because you are told it's your duty. But if you give up a lesser value to protect something more important to you, that isn't a sacrifice. That is just rational prioritization.
Let's ground that in a real-world example because it's a vital difference. Think about a parent who gives up a nice dinner out or a weekend getaway to stay home and care for their sick child. Culturally, we immediately label that a sacrifice.
Right, the sacrificing parent trope.
Exactly. But under this framework, that is absolutely not a sacrifice. Why? Because that parent deeply, fundamentally values the health and presence of their child infinitely more than they value a restaurant meal. They aren't surrendering. They are fiercely protecting their highest value.
And the exact same logic applies to a business owner. If an entrepreneur postpones buying a luxury car so they can pour that capital into their company's future, they aren't sacrificing themselves to the business gods. They are choosing the long-term success they value deeply over the short-term consumption they value less. The question you always have to ask is, well, which values matter most within your full context?
What's fascinating here is how this exposes a strange, almost hypocritical moral contradiction in our society.
Oh, Hassan.
We deeply admire people for caring about the well-being and the futures of others. But the exact moment a person applies that same serious, dedicated care to the quality of their own life, we become suspicious of them.
Oh, totally. We call them greedy. We assume they must be up to no good if they're working that hard for their own joy.
But you have one life to live and one mind to direct it. No one else can live with the consequences of your choices in your place. Therefore, treating your own life as an afterthought in your moral thinking is entirely irrational.
Okay, so if we accept that, if we realize that caring for our own lives isn't a moral crime, we immediately hit the next major friction point. Knowing this in theory is easy, but what happens when you actually build that successful life?
That's the real test.
Right. When your competence produces visible results. Money, a stable family, a thriving career, because that's when the external pressures really start knocking on the door.
Yeah, that phenomenon is referred to here as the mortgage of success. When you build a well-managed life, a subtle moral claim often appears from the people around you. Society frequently treats success as a public utility.
Oh, public utility. Wow.
The unstated implication is that because you have more ability or more stability, you somehow owe an undefined portion of your energy, your wealth, or your time to anyone who has less.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here because this is the exact moment where these ideas can sound incredibly harsh, almost callous. If success isn't a public utility, does that mean the logical conclusion is to just be ruthless? Do you just hoard your resources, build a fortress, and completely ignore anyone who is genuinely suffering or in need?
That is the most common critique of this philosophy, but it's a misinterpretation. The framework makes a razor-sharp distinction between compassion and coercion.
Okay, walk me through that.
Need is a reality of the world. Seeing someone in need might evoke immense compassion in you, and it might give you excellent personal reasons to help them. But the argument is that need, entirely by itself, does not establish a moral claim against your property or your life.
So compassion is a voluntary response to something you value. You help a friend because you value the friendship. You support a charity because you value the cause and want to see it succeed in the world.
Exactly. Compassion is an expression of your values. Coercion, on the other hand, is a demand that your own values become irrelevant. Coercion is the idea that you must give up what you've earned simply because someone else demands it, regardless of your own judgment. The argument here is that your prosperity does not create an automatic, unchosen debt to those who have less.
Which means self-interest does not equal exploitation. And that is a huge mental leap for a lot of people. We tend to think that if you are living for yourself, you must be manipulating or stepping on other people to get ahead.
Yeah, that's the stereotype.
But if you genuinely value your own life, you have every logical reason to value honesty, trust, and justice in your interactions. Because other people are not resources for you to consume, just as you aren't a resource for them to consume.
It actually demands a profound level of mutual respect. If you recognize your own absolute sovereignty over your life, you are logically bound to recognize that exact same sovereignty in everyone else. You can't demand they sacrifice for you either.
So we've covered the theoretical architecture here. We see how the faulty smoke detector of false guilt gets wired by a culture of self-erasure. We've redefined sacrifice as a loss rather than a virtue, and we've separated voluntary compassion from moral coercion.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But moving from theory to the messy reality of a Tuesday afternoon, how do you actually apply this? I want us to really execute on the focus of this deep dive. We both went through this material and we both pulled out one specific aspect that serves as a tool for actual life integration. For me, it was the section on the mechanics of questioning your own guilt.
That is arguably the most practical section of the entire framework.
Yeah.
Like, how are you visualizing the listener applying that?
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, when you close this deep dive and go back to your day? For me, the biggest takeaway is that you have to fundamentally change your internal monologue. When that wave of guilt hits you, the absolute worst question you can ask yourself is, why do I feel bad?
Because that just traps you in the emotion.
Exactly. It assumes the feeling is justified, and you end up rationalizing reasons to surrender. Instead, you need to integrate a specific diagnostic checklist.
You force the emotion to stand trial before your rational mind.
Yes. The next time you feel guilty for setting a boundary, say, refusing to loan money to a sibling who has a history of reckless spending, you stop and ask 3 things. What did I actually do? Whose rights were involved? What objective evidence establishes wrongdoing?
I love that.
If you run that checklist and realize, wait, I actually lied to my boss to cover up a mistake, then great. That's genuine guilt. It improves your character. You go apologize. You fix the mistake. You learn from it.
Yep.
But in the case of the sibling asking for money, you run the checklist. What did I do? I kept the money I earned. Whose rights were involved? Only mine. What evidence establishes wrongdoing? None. The checklist reveals that there is no fire.
Yeah, you could objectively see that you didn't violate anyone's rights.
You just violated a cultural standard you were taught. A standard that says you should surrender your stability to finance someone else's irresponsibility. You can use that checklist every single day to separate genuine, character-improving guilt from false, surrender-inducing guilt.
That is a highly effective way to short-circuit the cultural conditioning in real time. It moves you from a reactive state to a cognitive state. For my part, the aspect that stood out the most was a seemingly paradoxical idea. Living for yourself is harder than it sounds.
Which sounds completely counterintuitive, because when we hear living for yourself, the immediate image is someone throwing wild parties, blowing their savings, and just doing whatever impulsive thing pops into their head.
Right, people constantly confuse rational self-interest with impulsive indulgence. But a serious commitment to your own happiness requires intense discipline.
Because it's about the long game.
Exactly.
Yeah.
An impulsive action taken under emotional pressure, like lashing out in anger or neglecting your health for momentary pleasure, that can destroy a long-range value. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the integration here for the listener is about the discipline of what the text calls mutual independence, particularly in how you structure your relationships.
How does mutual independence play out in a modern relationship? Because relationships are usually where this friction is the absolute highest.
Oh, absolutely. It requires a fundamental reframing of how you connect with people. You need to integrate the concept of voluntary trade and completely abandon what we can call the sacrificial moral ledger.
Sacrificial ledger.
Yeah, let's look at how that operates in a marriage, for example. If you and your partner are constantly keeping track of who sacrificed more sleep, who gave up more weekend time for the in-laws, who suffered more this week, you are operating on a premise of debt.
Wow.
You are essentially saying that the relationship is paid for in the currency of suffering. It becomes a hostage negotiation. I surrendered this for you, so you owe me.
It's a toxic race to the bottom. Whoever is the most miserable holds the most moral authority in the house.
Precisely. Mutual independence argues for the exact opposite.
Yeah.
You evaluate your friendships, your business partnerships, and your marriage by asking, are we both bringing value here by choice?
So it's about mutual benefit.
Yes. You maintain the relationship because both of you actively gain joy, growth, and value from the association. You do things for each other, not because you owe a debt of suffering, but because making your partner happy is a high personal value to you. It is voluntary trade, emotionally and practically.
Now, I do want to make sure we address one specific caveat that always comes up when we talk about independence and not owing people, which is parental responsibility. Because a child obviously cannot engage in mutual independence.
No, of course not. And the framework explicitly notes that parental responsibility is a completely different category. A parent's obligation to a child doesn't arise merely from the child's need. It arises from the parent's choice to bring that child into existence. By making that choice, the parent has assumed a real, legitimate responsibility for that child's care and development. It is a chosen obligation, not an arbitrary, unearned debt placed upon them by society.
Which perfectly aligns with the core logic that your choices create your legitimate obligations.
Exactly.
Now, as you, the listener, start making these choices, as you start using that diagnostic checklist and demanding mutual independence and actually living for your own rational values, you are going to grow. You are going to become stronger, more capable, and probably a lot happier. And this leads to a final, incredibly important reality check from the text. Growth is not a betrayal.
But it will often be treated as one by the people around you.
Mm-hmm.
That is the social friction we mentioned at the beginning. When you start doing well and you stop accepting the sacrificial ledger, people push back.
Because you changed the rules of the game. And let's be honest, some people greatly preferred the older, weaker, more compliant version of you.
Oh.
They relied on your lack of boundaries to make their own lives easier. When you establish those boundaries, you might be accused of betraying them. You might be asked to explain why you won't accept the old, unhappy arrangements anymore.
Yeah.
But the standard you have to hold on to is whether your growth is real, honest, and earned. Shrinking yourself back down to preserve someone else's comfort is not a virtue. It is a tragic waste.
It is a waste of a human life, which is the only one you have. Your life is supposed to expand in ability, in confidence, and in joy. You should never have to apologize for becoming a more capable version of yourself.
So we've covered an immense amount of philosophical ground today. We started with the liberating realization that guilt is just an emotion, not a final verdict on your character. We learned that protecting your highest values is not a moral sacrifice, but a rational necessity.
Right.
We discussed how your life, your energy, and your success are not a public utility for the world to indiscriminately claim. And ultimately, we explored the idea that you do not need anyone's permission to fiercely desire and build a good life for yourself.
And you don't need to feel the phantom weight of false guilt for pursuing it, provided you do so honestly, respecting the sovereignty of others, and engaging with the world through voluntary trade rather than coercion.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the thought I want to leave you with today. Think back to that faulty smoke detector we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive, the one that has been screaming at you for years every time you try to prioritize your own well-being or say no to an unreasonable demand.
The false alarm.
Exactly. Once you run the diagnostic checklist, once you examine the standard behind your false guilt and realize it actually has no power over you, your only remaining job is to continue building.
That's the best part.
So here is the question for you to mull over tonight. If you could permanently disconnect that faulty smoke detector today, if you could permanently silence the voice of false guilt that tells you you're being selfish, what is the very first thing you would build for yourself tomorrow that you've been too afraid to start? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the standards you've inherited, and we'll see you next time.